Thank you. It's great to be here with you all, and I've got a PowerPoint slideshow, there's text and images, and what I would suggest is let me give you a dramatic reading of the text. You're allowed to look at the text if you want, but I would urge you to focus on the images. The text and images are in these packets that have been put together. I want to bring your attention to an historical artifact that's also in your packet, which is a conference on the Civil Rights Revolution held right after the March on Washington in 1963. And that's a very important conference that is discussed in the Freedom Budget book and so forth. So be sure that you take a look at that precious document. Okay, so here we go. And the book that Michael Yates and I wrote won a Choice Award for Outstanding Academic Title. We're very proud of that. That's great. I only have 3 copies, and you can get them for $12 a pop, or you can get it online. And it's a fairly inexpensive book, and I think it is a good book. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, the so-called Jim Crow system of racist segregation was established throughout the southern United States. Throughout the South, racists were finally successful in preventing most blacks from voting. The Jim Crow system included laws, especially a bogus literacy test, designed to stop blacks from being allowed to vote. Jim Crow was enforced by violence from groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, but also legally by the police. Poverty and unemployment, inadequate housing and education and health care were much higher among blacks than among whites. This was true in the North, too. The creation of black ghettos and the persistence of oppressive conditions of social and economic injustice were features of Northern life even without Jim Crow laws. While it may have been more intense in the South, there was an intense hunger for justice among African Americans throughout the land. Over the years, there have been many leaders of struggles for the liberation of African Americans, and nowadays they tend to be put on postage stamps. But each of these stamps represents important leaders and important struggles. Martin Luther King was one of these. Another was Malcolm X, who disagreed with King on many things, but agreed with him on the need to struggle for black liberation. In 1954, Thurgood Marshall, lawyer for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, persuaded the Supreme Court that segregation in public education violates the U.S. Constitution. Many Southern whites made it clear they would not accept this. This is one of the more polite signs indicating that. White racist mobs and also Southern state and local governments mobilized to preserve the Jim Crow system. White citizens' councils were organized throughout the South to mobilize racist opposition to civil rights. Dedicated individuals built a massive civil rights movement against racism, and they changed the history of our country for the better. Inspired by anti-colonial independence struggles, some civil rights tacticians were drawn to the nonviolent resistance struggles developed by Mohandas Gandhi in India. Martin Luther King became well known for standing up to racist authorities in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955-56, but there were many others, 2 of the most prominent being E.D. Nixon and Rosa Parks. Nixon, by the way, was a member. Nixon was a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters that was headed by A. Philip Randolph. We'll talk about him more shortly. Rosa Parks had been working for years through the NAACP, and her refusal to give up her bus seat to a white man resulted in her arrest and the successful Montgomery bus boycott. The black community of Montgomery rallied, marched, and walked rather than riding the segregated buses, building mass pressure that compelled the courts to order the desegregation of the public transit system. Montgomery developments inspired progressive currents throughout the country. Someone else who helped with the Montgomery bus boycott was Bayard Rustin, a skilled organizer who had been active in radical peace and human rights struggles for years and would remain so. Rustin had worked with A.J. Muste of the Fellowship of Reconciliation and David McReynolds of the War Resisters League, and became a seasoned organizer and central figure in applying nonviolent tactics in the struggle against the Jim Crow system. Another nonviolent radical who helped King was Ella Baker. Originally with the NAACP, she helped King establish the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and also the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She mentored, taught, and inspired innumerable numbers of young activists. Hundreds of dedicated organizers and activists became involved. In its early incarnation, SNCC emphasized a commitment to nonviolence and to an interracial movement to end racism. The first major act was to break the law by sitting in at whites-only lunch counters in the South. Sometimes it's right to break the law. Sometimes it's necessary to break the law, and they did that. SNCC helped to spearhead the struggle for black voting rights in the South. In 1964, it mobilized black and white students from the North to help with the Freedom Summer Project to advance voting rights and political organization. The heroism and dedication of the civil rights activists became legendary. We see here Fannie Lou Hamer, Stokely Carmichael, Eleanor Holmes, who later became Eleanor Holmes Norton, a U.S. Senator, Ella Baker, Bob Moses. In addition to voter registration, Freedom Summer operated freedom schools to teach children and adults literacy, literature, and history, especially African American history. Back then, that wasn't taught hardly anywhere. There was a powerful transformation of consciousness among African Americans, overcoming fear in order to stand up for their rights. These became words in the songs that they sang. Black ministers who were radical activists played an especially important role. Liberal and left-wing Southern whites provided important assistance, like Ann and Carl Braden of the Southern Conference Educational Fund. This issue of Monthly Review contains an amazing report by Ann Braden of the civil rights movement back in 1965. It's still worth reading. Another left-wing white Southerner was Miles Horton, director of the Highlander Folk School, which trained labor and civil rights organizers in the South. And you see his daughter, together with Pete Seeger, Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, and Rosa Parks. The White Citizens Councils and other defenders of Jim Crow smeared Highlander as a communist training school. Billboards throughout the South used this to attack King, but the civil rights movement could not be stopped by this kind of thing. Another important force for civil rights was the Congress of Racial Equality, headed by James Farmer. While active in the South, CORE had its largest base in the North, where it specialized in nonviolent direct action to challenge various problems related to racism. And we see here sit-ins and arrests taking place in New York City. CORE activists included Mary Hamilton, Ruth Turner, George Wiley, Floyd McKissick, Donald Elfie, Norman Hill, Velma Hill, and many, many more. In 1961, CORE organized the Freedom Rides, in which integrated delegations of activists in the North took Greyhound buses to the South to challenge racial segregation laws in transportation facilities. They faced arrest and violence. Some people got beaten pretty badly, such as Jim Peck here. In 1963, there was a major civil rights campaign initiated in Birmingham, Alabama. It involved large numbers of young people. Martin Luther King's SCLC played a central role in these protests. The police engaged in systematic intimidation, but the protests grew. Fire hoses were turned on the protesters. There were police dogs. There were massive arrests. Children were arrested too. The jails were filled. White clergymen in Birmingham sharply criticized Reverend King for causing so much trouble. King responded with his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. It's still worth reading. There were many martyrs, most of them African-American activists, such as Mississippi's outstanding NAACP leader, Medgar Evers. Some of the martyrs were children. In 1964, 3 civil rights activists, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, disappeared during Freedom Summer. Their bodies were found some weeks later. In 1965, Northern civil rights volunteer Viola Liuzzo was shot in the head one night in Alabama, and she drove black civil rights protesters back to their homes. Here's her car and her blood. Southern police forces were not interested in solving such murders. Some were involved in helping to carry them out. A. Philip Randolph, prominent black trade union leader and a veteran of many protests, called for a 1963 March on Washington to advance civil rights. He'd been involved for many, many years in the struggle. Randolph and his aide Bayard Rustin decided to call it a march for jobs and freedom, to link the issues of racial justice and economic justice. This was central to the strategic approach on the left, on the most astute sectors of the left, that linkage of the struggle for racial justice and economic justice. Rustin, central organizer for the march, worked tirelessly with the treasurer for the march, trade unionist Cleveland Robinson, and many, many others. The formal leadership of the march consisted of the nation's most prominent civil rights leaders, John Lewis of SNCC, Whitney Young of the Urban League, Randolph, King, Farmer, and Roy Wilkins of the NAACP. But what made the march a success was the mass participation. Massive trade union participation was mobilized, despite AFL-CIO President George Meany's short-sighted refusal to endorse the march. People came from across the land. Organizers hoped for at least 100,000. Police estimates put the crowd at 250,000. Some have said it was twice that large. Rustin asked the outstanding actors, husband and wife Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee, to organize entertainers and show business celebrities for the march, and they did. Among the singers were Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, Charlton Heston, of all people, author James Baldwin, Sidney Poitier, Marlon Brando, Harry Belafonte, many others were also on hand. But the march was made so impressive by the many, many everyday people who became part of it, who helped to make history. By the way, this is a slideshow I show to my students. So when I say everyday people, I throw in people like us. People like us made this march what it was. The words and ideas of Rustin, King, and others who spoke had greater resonance because of those who rallied to their words and ideas. The mass protests created a popular pressure that compelled passage and enforcement of civil rights and voting rights acts, ending the Jim Crow system. Even with the right to vote and the end of segregation, poverty and unemployment remained twice as high among blacks as among whites. When I say the end of segregation, I'm talking about the end of segregation laws. There was still segregation without the laws. Randolph, Rustin, King, and others concluded the best solution was full employment and a decent standard of living for all people. If you have twice as much unemployment and twice as much poverty among black Americans as among white Americans, which you had then, which you have now, there are two ways to achieve equality. One is to lay off a lot of white Americans and push more of them into poverty to even it out. The other way is to eliminate poverty, eliminate unemployment, and that's the strategy that they put forward. Many prominent civil rights figures were socialists, believing there was a link between racial justice and economic justice. All of these people were socialists. So were all of these people. By socialism, they meant our economy should be owned by society, should be democratically controlled, should be used to meet the needs of all. And some, not all of these folks, were in the Socialist Party. They contributed activism, but also analysis and strategy. The working class, the majority of the American people, was seen as a key to winning both racial and economic justice for all. Radical journalist I.F. Stone wrote that a two-day conference, the one that you have the flyer for in your packets, a conference on the Civil Rights Revolution organized by the by the Socialist Party and attended by 400 activists the day after the march, provided discussions far superior to speeches at the March on Washington, arguing that the civil rights movement must be merged into a broader plan for social change. As socialists, they wanted decent jobs for all, an end to poverty, decent housing for all, decent health care for all, decent education for all, human rights for all, rule by the people, democracy over our political and economic life. Such values were contained in a freedom budget for all Americans that they put forward in 1966. Endorsed by over 200 prominent civil rights, labor, religious, and academic leaders, it offered a plan to end poverty within a 10-year period. And then I say to the students, can you imagine what it would have been like if years before you were born there was no more poverty, no more unemployment? The Freedom Budget was designed to provide decent living conditions and dignity for all, eliminating the material causes of racism so that blacks and whites who are at the lower end of this economic scale would not be competing for scarce resources, which generates significant amount of racist attitudes, certainly among whites. But at the same time that the Freedom Budget was put forward, a U.S. military escalation in Vietnam was taking place, drawing energy and resources away from resolving racial and economic injustices. This was a problem. Major figures associated with the Freedom Budget felt electoral politics and support of the Democratic Party must be keystones for their strategy. And Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson was committed to a bipartisan policy of defeating communism in Vietnam. The war in Vietnam split the forces that might have supported the Freedom Budget. They did support the Freedom Budget. Some supporters, not all, joined with Martin Luther King to mobilize against the war. King's last years included the struggle for the Freedom Budget, the Poor People's Campaign, the Memphis sanitation workers' strike, all seeking to secure economic justice for the majority of people. The problem with the Freedom Budget was that it would have meant an economic and political power shift away from the wealthy. And the wealthy and the politicians whom they funded, Democrats as well as Republicans, didn't want to allow that. The divided civil rights movement and decline of the struggle meant they didn't have to. Persisting economic justice, growing inequality, the spread of poverty, unemployment and underemployment, declining living standards, declining quality of life, all the things that have grown since 1968, the Freedom Budget was designed to do away with such things. The civil rights agenda of such people as Randolph, Rustin, and King was partly fulfilled. The Jim Crow segregation laws were knocked down. Voting rights guaranteed to all, regardless of race. The culture of fear in the South was significantly pushed back. Greater dignity and pride for African Americans was achieved to a significant degree. Positive shifts among whites in the larger culture regarding race took place. But there was a lot that was not accomplished. Racism and racial tensions have yet to be fully overcome. Poverty, with all its negativity, has yet to be overcome. Unemployment and economic insecurity have yet to be overcome. Decent housing and health care have yet to be provided for all. Good education has yet to be provided to all. Those who hope for a better future can learn much from the experiences of the civil rights movement. These are the kind of photographs you may have seen over the past few years. All of these particular photographs were taken in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, my hometown. But this kind of stuff has been happening all over the place. Okay, that's my presentation.